It is a privilege for me to be here this morning. I want to greet you all in the name of the Lord. First of all, my chairman and my father in the Lord, Pastor Bukola Oladiyun. I greet you, sir. I greet all the ministers of God in the house this morning. I greet all of us. And I believe that at the end of this session, we'll have cause to give God thanks for exposing us and for opening our understanding concerning our health. I've been told this morning to speak about health in the area of stress management. And I know that this is something that is very common to each and every one of us when we talk about stress. Please, can we put up the slides? I first of all want to share a scripture. The head of the pastorate actually shared this scripture when he started ministering earlier on. And that scripture is from Jeremiah 29:11, which says, For I know the thoughts that I think towards you, saith the Lord, thoughts of peace and not of evil, to give you an expected end. I tell you that there is a thought in the mind of God concerning our health. And if we go further to read 3 John verse 2, it says, Beloved, I wish above all things that thou mayest prosper and be in health, even as thy soul prospereth. So it means that God wants us to be spiritually sound, but not at the detriment of our physical health. It is a responsibility for each and every one of us to make sure that we are fit physically, because that is what God desires for us. Now, all of us have encountered stress in various dimensions. It might have to do with work pressure. It might have to do with home issues. It might have to do with our expectations and the things that we want to get done. But there are certain definitions of stress. Now, stress refers to any action or situation that places a physical or a psychological demand on a person. If there is any action, whether in your environment or even within you, that is placing that demand on you, it can be referred to as stress. It can also be referred to as a body's response to pressure. How do you respond to pressure? We are all different. The way my father in the Lord will respond to pressure will be different from how I will respond to it. It all depends on the capacity that we have. So you must not compare yourself with another person and think that you can do the same thing that this person is doing. We must realize that it is different for each and every one of us. But in summary, when we talk about stress, we'll say that it happens when the pressure that one is facing exceeds your perceived ability to cope. So you yourself, the way in which you see yourself will determine whether you are stressed or not. If you see yourself as not being able to cope with the situation and that pressure comes, then you won't be able to cope. So that's why managing stress, as we'll see, has a lot to do with our thought life. And we're going to look at that later on. Now, what are some facts about stress? How about the slides? I would like us to follow because that will actually help us. Now, the fact about stress. Stress is actually part of day-to-day living. It's inevitable. We can't escape from it. And if we don't have some measure of stress in our lives, then we'll not be able to fulfill certain tasks. So it's important for us to know that we can't escape from stress. And it is no respecter of persons. I'm sure that you will know that the President of the United States of America is not excluded from pressures and from stress, despite the fact that he has everything at his disposal. We know that they say the rich also cry. No matter how wealthy you are, no matter how good your job is going, you will be exposed to some level of stress. But let us take note that mild stress energizes. Mild stress energizes and motivates you. So if there's nothing pushing you, you could discover that you are laid back and you're not making any progress. But when there are high levels of stress in your life, that will lead to what we call distress. Any form of distress in itself is actually hazardous to our health, and it is deadly. And that is why we're talking about it today. When we realize what stress is and what causes it and what predisposed to it, then we'll know better how to manage it. Now, stress, what causes it? Stress is caused by stressors. Anything that is capable of creating a disturbance within your system, any form of imbalance, that is called a stressor. And we can look at the different types of stressors that we have. These sources of stress can come from fears that we have. Maybe you have the fear of failure. Maybe you have a belief that is limiting. You know, sometimes we make confessions, but in your heart, have you really believed it? If you have a limiting belief about yourself and you know, make confessions, it doesn't really make a difference. So what is in your inside is so important. The stress can also come from life changes. Life changes are inevitable. We can't escape from maybe the death of a loved one. You know, sometimes we might have to change house, moving house. Changing from one accommodation to another in itself is a stress. Not to talk of, you know, being thrown out, you know, by a landlord. Relationship problems are stressors. Occupation, maybe what you are facing in the place of work. All those things are sources of stress. But I'm going to break them down as we go on so that we'll know how this thing plays out in our system. Now, there are two major elements that are involved in stress. These elements are either extrinsic or intrinsic. When we say intrinsic, that means something from within, something on your inside that is generated from within your own mind or your soul. And there are stimulants that play this role. One of them is anger. Anger is a very, very common source of stress. And that is because the way in which we react to situations, if you react to a situation in an angry manner, definitely you are going to create an angry environment, and that will stress you. If you are fearful, that can also be an intrinsic source of stress. For example, you are preparing for an examination. You've probably studied, you know, but that fear is just lurking on the inside. Am I going to make it? That fear in itself is enough to stress you and prevent you from passing that exam, despite the fact that you have read and read. Sometimes excitement, too, can be a form of stress. Well, sometimes excitement, most of the time, could be something positive, you know, but it could create some stress for that person. Frustration. What are the other extrinsic elements involved in stress? There are some of these things we take in, you know, and that's why we'll also talk about our lifestyle. Some of the things we take in contain certain elements that can cause stress. Some of them include tea. Some of them include coffee. Actually, I'm not going to tell you to stop taking tea in any form, whether Lipton or any form of tea, but we must understand that the levels of caffeine in some of these drinks are high. There are some that have lower levels. We know that coffee in itself has a lot of caffeine. So if you love coffee, you can take the decaffeinated caffeine because the levels of caffeine are much lower. So, but if you are the kind of person that can take 7 cups of tea in a day, especially 7 cups of coffee when you get to work because you just want to keep yourself alert, at the end of the day, it will result in a crash. And you find out that you'll be stressed at the end of the day. Other things in that regard are sugar, refined sugar. Some people can take up to 7 bottles of Coke in a day. I had a classmate in school then. Any opportunity she got, you know, she would take a bottle of Coke. And, you know, when I saw her some months ago, I was wondering whether this was the same person I knew back then. So refined sugar, salt. I'm sure you know that most of the time when you go to the hospital, the doctor will always say reduce the level of salt because salt has been related with a lot of things, high blood pressure, liver problems. The environment is also a source of stress. What are the things in our environment? You know, we live in a busy environment. Lagos. I remember when I first moved to Lagos some few years ago, I was a bit alarmed at, the way cars move up and down. I think the very first day I got in a Molue, I regretted getting on a Molue bus. I thought it would just take me to my destination and the bus would wait for me, but I almost fell off, So later I got to understand that, no, I'm not supposed to be taking a Molue. So there are so many ways in which our environment can affect us. Even the gaseous combustion coming from some of these engines that are enough to stimulate us. The carbon monoxide in some of these elements can stimulate us and make us to become stressed. Exhaust fumes, a dirty environment. I'm sure there are some of us that you can't really think very well if a place is dirty. You might not be able to achieve anything once a place is dirty or disorganized, because it creates a stressful atmosphere for the brain. Extremes of weather can also create a stress for you. For those of us who are used to being in the tropics, if you happen to go to Poland, it will be a stress for you. So you must be able to do certain things, to be able to cope with that stress, and we'll look at that as we go on. We also have organizational stress. This happens to people who work in business settings. You have to work in the office. You have a boss, there's a hierarchy, you have to report to someone, there are expectations and deadlines. Sometimes we do have people who understand, what exactly you can bring onto the table. But sometimes we have difficult bosses. There was a day I was consulting, and someone came into the consulting room and was just telling me about some of the complaints he had, how he's always having headache. And I tried to look around, taking a good history, what exactly could be the cause of the headache. You could be tempted to just write tablets of paracetamol 2-3 times a day and go home, it will go. But I just decided to take some more time to ask about his job, what goes on in the office. And in fact, at the end of the day, I realized that was where the headache was coming from, because of the difficulty he was having in the office with his boss, who would not accept anything he did. And he himself confessed to me that, in fact, he knows that is the source of his stress. And so we were able to address that area. Role conflicts, job overload, poor working conditions, if you are not able to participate in decision making, job insecurity, lack of recognition, responsibility for other people. When you're overwhelmed by responsibility for other people in a workplace, they say the person at the top has no rest. So that could create a lot of organizational stress. Role ambiguity. There are some of us at work, you don't really know what your job descriptions are. Someone tells you to do this, another person tells you to do that. That ambiguity can create organizational stress. Poor relationship with colleagues and tight deadlines. Our relationships are so important. If you have a poor relationship with people, poor interpersonal relationships is something that will lead to stress. Now, let's look at this stress curve. I talked about the fact that a little form of stress or mild stress is important for us. If you have too little stress, if you are underloaded, then you become inactive and laid back. And that's what we can see at the bottom of the curve around the green area. And that will definitely affect our performance when we don't have enough stress. But there is an area of optimum stress for us, and that is the yellow area we're looking at. Once we cross the area of optimum stress, we'll become fatigued, we'll become exhausted, and we'll become overloaded. And then at the end of the day, you discover that the curve will begin to drop. You can see the area of the optimum between green and orange. So the yellow area begins to go down once you become overloaded. And at the end of the day, it results in anxiety, panic, and anger because you feel you are not meeting up with some certain expectations. And a lot of people do burn out at the end of the day. So it is very important that we learn how we're supposed to cope with certain stress sources. Now, so let's look at some of the causes of stress, apart from organizational stress. There are some things that impact on us intrinsically. They will affect our thought pattern. Like I said before, fear of failure or fear of poverty. We know that we're all working to survive. We want to make ends meet. So some people, because of that fear, they want to make sure they get all they can. That fear creates a lot of stress for us. Pressure to succeed, sickness, insecurity, loss of job, financial pressures, being in debt, all these things create a lot of stress for us. Poor interpersonal relationships, like I said, it could be from our relations. Maybe you have in-laws that live with you. They are so demanding. You can't really pray for your mother-in-law to die, but you can pray for her to favor you. So there are different ways in which you can manage stress, but it's important that we know that these are some of the causes. So if you are having certain symptoms, which I'm going to go on to, you can begin to focus on those areas and you will know how to manage them. We can see that in this picture, this lady is trying to cram a lot of things into that suitcase. I think a lot of us do this. In one single day, we want to cram so many things into that day. We can't even say no. When someone says, do this for me, another person says, do this for me. We want to cram everything into one day. That is going to create a lot of stress for us. Now, I mentioned a mild level of stress. It is called eustress. That means positive stress. Eustress, that is EU and then stress. So that is a positive form of stress for us. We have the negative form, which is distress. So when you have the optimum level of stress, this will stimulate you, it will invigorate you, and it will enrich your life. And at the end of the day, this will lead to fulfillment and achievement of all your goals and objectives. This is very important because sudden changes will come to us. We can't avoid it, like I said earlier. So when you recognize the fact that this is a positive form of stress and you adjust your thought pattern to accommodate it, then we'll be able to live. Examples of positive stress include work challenges and deadlines, mental and emotional challenges, physical fitness training, examinations. Definitely there are optimum levels for this, and when you start having certain symptoms, you know that you have gone beyond the optimum level of stress. We've talked about the negative stress, which is due to persistent and long-term pressure. We said we can't escape it, but this is bad when it is long-term because of the prolonged duration. And so at the end of the day, there's decreased productivity, like we saw in that graph. There's a breakdown in health, and there's inefficiency. So you have piled up all sorts to do. At the end of the day, if it becomes prolonged, it will lead to inefficiency. There are some of us who are students, we're doing undergraduate programs. Some of us are in postgraduate school. If we procrastinate and we leave everything to the last minute, and you try to read 10 books in one day, you become stressed. So you'll be tempted to cram what you need to learn for that exam. And you discover that at the end of the day, when you go for that exam, you won't remember anything. There was someone who read overnight all the while to the following morning of the exam. By the time the person got to the exam, the person couldn't remember anything. The person had what we call a brain block. It happens, and that is because we overload and cram our systems inappropriately. So stress affects our body, our mind, our emotions, our behavior. There are certain things that will happen when you are stressed. You begin to worry constantly. You find out that your thinking is muddled up. You are thinking something and you are saying something else. Your judgments could be impaired. You could have nightmares. You could be indecisive, and you make hasty decisions. So these are some of the ways in which stress, can affect our mind. It can also affect our emotions, such that we become irritable. So if you see someone who is very irritable, the person is always having mood swings, the person, alienates himself and doesn't really want to mix with other people, and the person is always apprehensive, then it's likely that that person is going through a form of stress. That could also happen in the area of our behavior, the way you behave towards your husband or your children. If you are always saying that you are not interested in sex, that is what we call loss of libido. When you lose interest, that could be a sign of stress or depression. If you become accident prone, you discover that you're always tripping over things. When you want to pick something, that thing drops. It might be that you are not focusing, and so that is a sign that you are stressed. How about in our body? Frequent headaches, feeling tired, getting breathless, always having infections. You find out that you're always ending up in the hospital for one reason or the other. There's more likely to be a stress factor involved. Some people believe they have malaria every month. When someone comes to me and says, oh, I have headache, I'm feeling feverish, I don't conclude that is malaria. I know that it is one of the most commonest causes of malaria here, but I discovered that stress even causes those symptoms even more commonly than malaria. So some people end up treating malaria every month. It's not necessary. If you just give yourself some time to rest and make some lifestyle changes, you will discover that all those symptoms will go. These are examples of short-term responses to stress. A dry mouth. When you're stressed out, you just discover that your mouth is dry. There is no saliva coming out. Your hands become sweaty. Your feet become sweaty. You discover that you're more sensitive to pain. There are some people in hospital, when you just want to give them an injection, they're so sensitive. Something that is not supposed to cause you serious pain, becomes more painful. You discover that you could have palpitations. I don't know how many of us know what palpitations are. When you have an awareness of your heart is beating faster and faster. That sometimes that happens and you can't really pinpoint what is causing it. So that is a sign of stress. Frequent urination for someone who is about to enter the exam hall, and that is the time when he wants to go and ease himself or use the toilet. That is also a sign of a short-term response to stress. Tensed muscles, which can lead to back pain and body pains. You could see someone with the brow. Sometimes looking at a person, looking at the brow or the facial appearance of that person will tell you that the person is stressed. So these are just examples of the ways in which we could respond to stress on a short-term basis. Then how about the long term? If stress is prolonged over a very long period of time, you begin to lose appetite. You just discover that you don't like eating anymore. You don't digest food well. You have heartburns. You could have an ulcer. You could have increased blood pressure. Most times when people come to the hospital and their blood pressure is high, I don't rush to place them on medication, because it might just be a stress that is, if that stress is addressed at that time, you discover that the blood pressure will just go down. And some people think that the blood pressure is because you are thinking. Not necessarily. You might not really be thinking so much about how a particular situation is, and that person will have high blood pressure. But it is usually a sign also of stress. Increased heart problem, angina. Angina means heart pain, pain of the heart. And one can actually develop pain in the heart as a result of anxiety. When you feel anxious and worried, it can result to heart pain. Constipation and diarrhea, not being able to move your bowel regularly. You can't go to the toilet. When you go to the toilet, you strain. This could be as a result of stress and anxiety. There was a woman who lost her husband and her father within months of each other. Within those 3 months, her hair turned completely white. And that was because of the stress that she encountered. There are some people that will lose hair just because of the stress they are facing. This is also some of the ways in which we can respond to stress on a long term. I've already mentioned some of them. Poor sleep, poor libido, inability to concentrate or think deeply, being irritable, lack of drive, susceptibility to illnesses and dizziness. So these are some of the things that show that we are stressed. Now, so what does this result in? At the end of the day, if we have all these symptoms, there is no way you will not become aggressive. You just discover that when your partner or your children are talking to you, you don't even want to listen to them because of what you have carried home from the office and what has bothered you so greatly. It can result in marital strife, sexual problems. Some people resort to drinking. Of course, insomnia, which means lack of sleep, fear and worry, eating junk food instead of proper meals. Because a woman is so stressed up, she can't even cook anymore because she can't really pay attention to some of those things. Hyperactivity. So these are some of the results of stress. Well, you wonder, but why must I have this stress? What can I do? Because of this continuous interaction between our bodies and the extrinsic and the intrinsic environment, we have to manage it. We need to learn how to manage it. And that is a good news for us today. We can control stress levels. Our ability to cope with the stress will actually depend upon our genetic makeup. We all have different genetic makeups. If you look at your father might have a tendency to always be calm about certain things. Maybe your mother is just the direct opposite, and you have taken some of those genes. You know, sometimes you even tell them, your child, that when you say a child acting in a particular way, they will tell you that, this child is behaving exactly the way the father behaved. So we should remember that our genetic makeup is different, and that should help us to be able to accommodate people around us. Our personality is also different. The social environment in which we all grew up is different. Our emotional balances are different. If you grew up in a home where you had two loving parents, you know, the way in which you will relate with other people will be different from someone who grew up with just one parent or someone that grew up with an abusive parent. So people who have such areas or such issues or deficiencies, they might even need counseling to be able to help them to get over certain areas so that they will be able to handle stress better. It's important for us to know that stress has nothing to do with how many hours you work, and everything to do with how you feel during those hours. So let's say you are working 8 hours. The thoughts that pass through your mind during the hours when you are working is what really causes the stress. So that's why we're talking about coping mechanisms. So someone who works for 12 hours might not feel stressed, and someone that works for just 3 hours might feel stressed just because of the way in which they feel during those hours. And so what is the key to stress management? The key to stress management is balancing workload. We talk about work-life balance. It's very important for us to be able to balance our home, the expectations in our home from our husband and children with work. And also on the social platform, we must develop that skill. It is all about taking charge of your lifestyle, your thoughts, your emotions, and the way you deal with problems. We need to take charge of our thoughts. God keeps on saying something in his word. He says, my thoughts are not your thoughts. My ways are not your ways. Because he knows the human mind. He knows our frame. You know, and that is why we need to develop the thoughts that God would think towards us. So if we take charge of our thought life, we take charge of our emotions, you discover that no matter how stressful your life seems, you'll be able to relieve the pressure. And you'll be able to develop healthier ways to cope with stress and reduce the harmful effects of stress. These are some unhealthy ways in which people cope with stress. Some people resort to smoking, drinking, binging, just sitting in front of the TV for many hours, withdrawing from friends and family, using pills or drugs to relax. Some people even use recreational drugs. Some people end up sleeping too much. People procrastinate and fill up every minute of the day to avoid facing problems. Taking out stress on other people, lashing out angrily, and being physically violent are ways in which people cope with stress, but these are unhealthy ways. So we will now look at the healthy ways in which we can cope with stress. The very first thing we must realize is that we want to prevent distress, because we know that a mild form or optimum level of stress is important for us to be able to perform and meet our deadlines. But when we want to prevent distress, that is the negative form of stress, number one, we must be able to determine the sources of stress in our lives. And that was why I went to town to highlight some of the areas in which we might be facing stressful situations, whether from your family, from your work, from your organization, or from some of the expectations that you have for yourself. So once you are able to determine those sources, you can write them down, and you now begin to work on how to deal with them. Then you must become aware of your own reaction to stress. Now, based on some of the symptoms, the short-term responses I mentioned, the long-term responses I mentioned, if you know that whenever you encounter a stressful situation, you become angry, then you must be able to write it down and determine how you're going to manage angry feelings. If you are the kind of person that gets frustrated whenever you encounter a challenging situation, write it down, and you must begin to plan and work on how you are going to handle frustrating feelings, because it all starts from the inside. Once you are able to change your thoughts and your feelings, it will also change your actions and your reactions. Then reinforcing positive self-statements is so important, and that is one thing I enjoy about the Clam Church and the little contact that I've had here. You know, we confess God's word, and when you confess what you believe, that will really help us. You know, I could be going to work, and I know that my boss has a very funny way of behaving, but I don't begin to think of how she's going to react to me when I get to work. I rather want to focus on God's word and confess God's word as I'm going. I'll say, Lord, I thank you because I have favor with God and with man. I thank you because in you I live and move and have my being. You just focus on reinforcing statements, things that, can boost your own confidence in who you are as a child of God. So you discover that focusing on those thoughts and making those confessions will actually prevent distress. Focus on your good qualities and success. And this is something that our daddy in the Lord does. When he discovers talent in someone, he tries to focus on it and build it up. We can also decide to do that for ourselves. If you know that you have some positive areas in your life, there are some things you do better than others. Let's focus on those things and let us grow them. Avoid unnecessary competition. Don't try to be like the Joneses. Don't try to buy everything that someone else is buying because there is a party going on. Develop assertive behavior. Assertive behavior means you can say no. It's not everything that you must accept. Recognize and accept your limits and be yourself, remembering that everyone is unique and different. So if you remember that you are a unique person, the way God has created you is different from every other person, and you are able to recognize this, you'll be able to accept your limits and be yourself. What else can we do to prevent distress? Let us set realistic goals for ourselves. At the beginning of every year, maybe the year 2015, you wrote down the goals, some of the things you wanted to achieve. So you must be realistic in what you are setting. If you set unrealistic expectations and you are trying to meet up with some of those expectations, you will discover that you become distressed. Also set priorities. Once you have set the goals for yourself, what are the ones that are most important? At the beginning of every week or at the beginning of every work day, it's good to set out what your priorities are for that day. What are the things you hope to fulfill in that day? When we are able to do this, it will prevent us from getting stressed up unnecessarily. Time management is also very important. How do we manage our time? If we crowd everything into 1 hour or into one day, we'll become stressed. But if we're able to budget our time appropriately, we'll discover that there's less pressure on us. If we plan ahead, we'll reduce the amount of pressure on us as well. I've talked about making a daily or a weekly schedule. When we do this and we try to follow it consistently, you discover that you will reduce a lot of the stressful areas in our lives. There is something that I call the 5 A's. The 5 A's will help us to remember how we can handle stress. The first A is avoid. The second is alter. The third is adapt. The fourth is accept. And then the A and the last one is adopt. So what do these phrases mean? When they say avoid, I talked about being assertive, being able to say no and avoid certain stressors. Sometimes you might have to break certain relationships. It might even be a business relationship. It might be an emotional relationship with a boyfriend or with a fiancé, because you know that that relationship is creating a lot of stress for you. You don't have to manage and keep on hoping that things will turn out better. You might need to break that relationship. You might need to avoid certain people. There are some people that will come to your house and they will take out all your time. You can't do anything else. You need to avoid such people. You can control your environment. For example, if you walk on the island and you live around here, you know what the traffic can be like. So instead of taking the busy routes, you could look for a less traveled route so that you will reduce the task on your brain. There are sometimes we cannot avoid, but we can alter. So when you cannot avoid, please do not bottle up the feelings you have, but be open, honest, and manage your time better. So sometimes you might have to tell your friend that, I'm sorry, I can't do this today. I can't help you with this. Let's be honest about it, and let us not feel that our friends will be offended. Let's also adapt and look at challenges as opportunities. Sometimes the challenges that we face are opportunities for us to grow. Don't try to control the uncontrollable. And that is why we need to accept some certain things. We know that sometimes there are economic problems. We know how much a dollar is to the naira. You might have to just accept that situation, pray and pray through, and look for the upside of whatever is happening at that time. Sometimes we have to learn how to forgive. There's an analogy that someone shared. If you bring a glass cup now, a tumbler, and I tell you to hold it, holding it, do you think holding a tumbler, a glass tumbler, an empty glass, do you think it will create any form of stress for you? You just take a tumbler and you're holding it. It doesn't seem as if it will cause any stress. But now, if you hold that tumbler for 24 hours, what do you think will happen? It is the same tumbler that someone has held for 1 hour without any stress. But because you are holding it for a longer period, you discover that you become stressed. So let us let go of certain grievances. Let us let go of frustrations. Let us let go of what people have done to us to make us feel bad. And when we let go of that tumbler, then we'll reduce our stress. Then the last thing I'll talk about is a healthy lifestyle. And I know that this is very important for all of us. A healthy lifestyle actually has to do with our physical activity, and it also has to do with our diet. I won't go into details of our diet because I know we're going to talk about nutrition, but being physically active and incorporating regular exercise into our daily schedule is important. The least form of exercise which is recommended by the World Health Organization is exercising 30 minutes a day. And this can help us to lose weight. It can help us to reduce our blood pressure. Walking, running, swimming, dancing, cycling, and doing aerobic exercise. These are important things in our physical activity. For people who sit in the office 24/7, their stress levels will be higher than people who exercise regularly. Try it. Once you start exercising, you will discover how good you feel after that exercise. Eat a healthy diet. High fiber diet, which includes vegetables, which includes fruits, and a lot of water is important for us. Try to take breakfast. If you take breakfast every morning, you discover that you have a less tendency to be stressed because it is the glucose from what you have eaten that will go to the brain. But if you want to eat at midday after doing a whole lot of work, by the time you eat that meal, you feel so tired and fatigued. So it is better to take the breakfast and have a late lunch. Avoid caffeine and sugar, like I said before, which give temporary highs, but later crash your mood and energy. Caffeine and sugar, they lead to a release of some of these hormones, stressful hormones, which we call corticosteroids. When they are released, they cause a crash in your mood and your energy. Avoid alcohol, cigarettes, and drugs, and try and get enough sleep. Sometimes you might need to take some nutritional supplements because some of us don't really take out time to take enough fruits and vegetables. There are some of these things that are stress busters, and they can reduce the way in which we respond to stress. Social support is also important. No man is an island. You can't do it on your own. Even in your office, teamwork is so important. Reach out to a colleague at work. Other than the work of the office, you can talk about other things, family, life. You can relax. You can volunteer, help someone else. By the time you help someone else and donate to other people, you find out that you feel more fulfilled and less stressed. Have lunch or coffee with a spouse or a friend. You could even go to the movies or a concert. You could write an email to an old friend you've not seen in years. Meet new people by taking a class. You could go for a PhD, like Daddy said he's going to. You could make sure that you're active in church. All these things are very important because they are means of social support. You can confide in important people such as your pastor, your teacher, or a coach. And you discover that when you do this on a regular basis, it will reduce your stress. A lot of women who come to the hospital and say they have something moving all over their body, they feel a vibrating sensation in their head. Some people will call it a walker. Some people, there are so many names that they will give it. But in the long run, I discovered that most of these women, they don't talk. They don't have opportunities to express themselves. It is more common in women than in men. So when you're not able to express yourself appropriately, you become stressed. But when you're able to do some of these things and engender social support, like I've said, then you are going to minimize your stress. What are the other relaxation techniques? Make sure you play with your children. You can listen to or watch comedies so that you'll be able to laugh. We say that laughter is the best medicine. Regular exercise, like I said before. Worship, spending time to worship God. Listen to music. Spending time in prayer. Making sure we pay attention to some of the hobbies we have. There are some of us who like playing football, but you have not played football in years. There are some of us who loved handball or basketball in school, tennis. Let us begin to, go back to some of these hobbies that we have. Make sure you take your vacation. Some of us will work in the office all throughout the year. Even when it's time for your leave, you prefer to just take the leave allowance and sit in the office. Please let us make sure we take our entitlement. Let's go on outings. Let's retain our sense of humor. You don't have to be serious all the time. Always find some, funny elements in some of the things that we come in contact with. This is a stress relief toolbox, and I've already mentioned some of these things earlier on. Also, reading a good book, walking in your garden, taking a long bath. These are also ways of relieving stress. Now, there is an action plan that I would like us to write it down. This is the last slide. Let us write it down. The sample stress management action plan. Number 1, we have the psychological, which includes our thinking skills and projection imagery skills. If you notice, most of what I've been saying today has to do with our thoughts and how we are able to control our thoughts. So psychologically, you decide that this week I'm going to have a way in which I'm going to manage my stress levels in the psychological aspect. So thinking skills, you write down what are the things that I think about mostly. So those things that you think about mostly, you now begin to work on them. Then projection imagery. What are the projection imagery skills that we can develop? That sometimes when we think, it usually comes with an image. But rather than think about the negative aspects, we begin to focus on a positive image of what our thoughts are. Then the second thing, apart from psychological, is behavioral. Let's write it down. We've talked about social support. social support and the way in which we relate to people around us is one of the ways in which we can develop an action plan for ourselves. Assertiveness, being able to say no. Let's start to practice it. For people who are not assertive, begin to practice how to say no. And then under behavioral as well, write down time management. Make up your mind that I'm going to set priorities every week, and I'm going to avoid procrastination. Then under physical health, you write it down, exercise, nutrition, and relaxation. So this action plan is like a summary of all that we have said today. If we are able to change our thought pattern, you discover that some things that would have been stressful for us will no longer be stressful. So psychological, behavioral, and physical health action plans in relation to our thinking, social support, and then exercise, nutrition, and relaxation. So in conclusion, I want us to read Philippians 4:8, because we're talking about thinking for a change. And this is a scripture I love so much, and I like to share with my colleagues and people around me, because I know it makes a difference. It says, finally, brethren, whatsoever things are true, whatsoever things are honest, whatsoever things are just, whatsoever things are pure, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of good report, if there be any virtue, and if there be any praise, think on these things. Can we think about such things? If you assess your thinking pattern now, can you say you think about things that are honest and things that are just and lovely? I want us to ask ourselves that question so I will know where we can make changes. If there be any excellence, let's think on these things. If you are able to seek the peace of God, the same Philippians chapter 4, 6 and 7. Be careful for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known unto God, and the peace of God which passeth all understanding shall keep your hearts and your minds through Jesus Christ. If you have peace in your heart and your mind, you'll find out that you'll be less stressed and you'll remain calm in the face of challenges and stressful situations. So Paul knew what he was saying when he was saying, be anxious for nothing, be careful about nothing, because God's thoughts concerning you are thoughts that are good and not evil, to give you a future and a hope and to bring us to an expected end. So let us start to think for a change. Let's think about excellent things. Changing your thought pattern will change your beliefs, your expectations, your attitude, your behavior, and your performance, and therefore your ability to cope with stress and life. Only when you make the right changes to your thinking will other things begin to turn out right. I want to thank you very much for listening, and I'm going to welcome questions from us at this time.